I wanted to say a couple of words before, turning to the panel. I myself have interviewed Macron actually 4 times, originally when he was finance minister, when I went totally out on a limb and said it looked like he could be the next president of France, although I thought it was crazy to even think that. And then sure enough, he was the next president of France. And then subsequently as candidate, and subsequently after that 2 interviews which both made the cover of Time magazine. The one very shortly after his incredible 2017 victory, in which the cover line was, "The next leader of Europe, asterisk, if only he can lead France," which now seems very prophetic. The second cover, which was titled, I believe, Macron's Moment, was after he had finally gotten control of the Yellow Vest protests, in which I'd asked him what it felt like to be so vilified. And he said, and I quote, "I was elected, I am in charge, and I am the leader, so I take it. I don't care," unquote. So Macron's always interesting to interview. And then today, I'm not sure how many of you saw today's interview that Macron did with French television. He said some, many very quotable things, one of which stuck out in my mind was, in terms of reforming France, the longer we wait, the worse the situation will be. So with that, I wanted to turn to Matt first. And Matt, if you could kind of just capture for us a little bit of the economic arithmetic behind this. How much trouble is France in? Did we really need to put the country through this kind of total upheaval in order to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64?
First thing to note is that France indeed does have a very expensive pension program, more expensive than pretty much any other developed country, certainly at the top of the league the rankings in Europe, and far more expensive than America's Social Security program. France spends about 14.5% of GDP currently every year on pensions. And you look at the sort of demographic fundamentals, the number of French retirees is going to go up quite a bit, from 10 million, let's say, to 17 million in the coming decades. So, a dynamic that is happening, in every developed country. And actually, France is better off in that sense because its demographics are better, its fertility rate is higher. Then you combine that, but then you have to look at France has actually done a bunch of reforms already in the past few years. It did a series of reforms in 2010. In 2014, it also did reforms in which it lengthened the amount of time you need to work to get a full pension. And those things take a number of years to come into effect. And and so the European Commission and other economists look at the long-term projections for France's pension program and expenditure. And this is something that Emmanuel Macron hasn't really talked about, and the Macron government hasn't talked about, but over the coming decades through 2070, the burden of France's pension expenditure goes down quite a bit, actually, from about 14.5% of GDP right now to about 12% in 2070, when you make some kind of reasonable assumptions about population growth and the growth of the economy. And fundamentally, yes, there's going to be a lot more pension years to pay for, but France is going to become more wealthy. Its national GDP is growing. And so you put all those things together, and there's a strong case, I think, that maybe the status quo could stick around. You let the reforms that France has already done kick in, and those were controversial at the time. You let those work. Macron, I think, fundamentally, however, he's the French pension system right now indeed requires a lot of taxation to fund. And I think Macron fundamentally wants to reduce the burden of taxation on the French economy. So he is, he hasn't really talked about this, but I think that the one of the things he'd like to see in the future is for French tax cuts to really kick in. and for that to help out and just to give more space for tax cuts in the future.
So I just want to turn to you, Thierry. You have tracked Macron for a very long time, very close up and in great detail. And for that matter, you've tracked all of French politics for a very long time. So I guess my main question is, Macron is, I don't think it can be disputed, a brilliant man. He has an extraordinary grasp on an amazing range of subjects. How did we get to this awful point where, with such incredible lack of allies, it seems?
There we go. To go to the point you're making, is he is indeed an incredibly impressive guy. And I've had numerous occasions from people going into a meeting with him, whether they be large company CEOs, whether they be people advocating such or such issue, and coming out of the meeting and being in awe of the guy, because he was so good at, understanding the issue, at going in very deep into details, sometimes even more so than his advisor who had spent days and hours working on getting that meeting ready. So he is very impressive. But I think it's been a blessing and a curse, because he knows he's the smartest guy in the room all the time. And as a result, he doesn't listen to the others. And one of the reasons he finds himself in this situation today is precisely this. I think his government is short on political heavyweights. His entourage is short on people who are strong enough to give him sound advice, whether by mistake or by design. Maybe he didn't want people to give him advice. He doesn't listen to criticism. He doesn't listen to advice, even when it's very constructive. And he thinks he knows better all the time. And I think that's been, one of the flaws of his presidency from the start, and that explains a lot of the troubles in today.
Constant, you've seen a lot on the street in the last several months. How much has Macron simply sort of bungled the messaging of this? It just seems to me like even after all these months, we left kind of floundering for, the one message that he's trying to put across.
Right. I found today's interview quite interesting in that sense, because his message today to me appeared perhaps the clearest for the past 3 months about the pension reform. Basically, today he said this is not only about balancing the finances of that pension system, this is also about freeing up some money to invest in the green economy, to invest in the defense at a time of war in Europe. And that's a message which I think some people can understand, which I found more convincing than the messages we have had for the past 2 months. When it started in January, I think the initial message was actually this one. And then for some reason, they completely abandoned it. And they said it was all about balancing the finances of the system. And after that, we had a number of mistakes from the government about raising small pensions, for instance, to 1,200 euros. They said that it would benefit something about more than 200,000 people initially. Then some left-wing lawmakers came and said, well, actually, I have the numbers. It's probably going to benefit only a few thousands people. We had a message about how this reform was about fairness, and we found out that women would actually not benefit as much as men from this reform. So the message was really confusing, and it allowed the opposition just to increase their criticism and weaken the government's message. I was talking this morning to a lawmaker from Macron's party. And he told me something quite interesting. He said, I think this is just too late to convince people. This is too late, and we need to move on to something else. We need to move on to reforms that are going to be more consensual, abortion rights in the Constitution.
I mean, too late to convince people.
To convince people, yeah, because it's been 3 months that they've tried with very different and sometimes sometimes contradictory messages to convince people. And he was saying that the people in France are there's a fatigue around that message. They just don't trust the government anymore.
Victor, I want to turn to you because in some ways you're like the voice of history around here.
Thanks. That's not a compliment.
I mean, you have a long view of this, having been in and out of this country under 3 presidents. So I'm sure you've heard it, and I've heard it many, many times. France is impossible to change. Doesn't matter what you try, doesn't matter who's the president is. It just, you can never change anything in this country. Is that fair? And will we ever be in a place where we see real transformation in this country? Or is it transforming and we're just kind of not noticing because the protests today look like the protests from a decade ago or 2 decades ago or 1968 for that matter?
Yeah, I remember seeing people, burning cars in the 1980s. So yes, it has been going on for a long time. It was a famous British politician who said that all political careers end in failure, not a French one, unless those careers are cut short by disaster or death. And I think that has been proved true to a large extent in France. If you look at previous 2-term presidents, Macron was the first since Chirac to win a second term. They've all ended in failure or kind of decay. Even de Gaulle's second presidency, ended in sort of faded away. Basically, when the 1968 May uprisings took over the country, he went into a complete funk, and then the right, the center right, if you like, the Republicans came back and they won the elections in the subsequent year. But then when he tried to push through a referendum on constitutional reform, he lost, and then he just quit politics. Chirac's second term was nothing to write home about. Mitterrand sort of faded in old age, and there's a danger, I think, that Macron will also have a sort of slightly watered down or ineffective second term. But it is worth remembering, though, that when you say nothing can be done in France, in fact, as Matt said, there have been pension reforms under previous governments which are having an effect. And Macron has actually, in his first term, his government instituted some labor reforms that are one of the reasons why the social security system is not in much deficit, because he substantially reduced unemployment. And he made his kind of whole watchword for this term in office, to put the French back to work. And to some extent, he has succeeded, although France is still extraordinary in the sense that half the companies are desperately looking for employees, but France still has an unemployment rate of close to 7%, which is absolutely extraordinary compared to other countries. But it is much lower than it was before, and it could go lower still. And that's obviously Macron's aim. So I don't think it's true to say that it is impossible to reform France. And just lastly, I mean, when you look at the sort of uprising on the streets, it's what we got now. It's interesting to note that it's essentially not revolutionary. This is a conservative revolution. People don't want a reform. It's a negative revolution. And I would be, in a way, I would be more sort of impressed by a revolution on the streets that was in favor of something dramatic that Macron could in fact do, like, a proper climate change policy, dramatic ecological policies that would help France and make France stand out. Or, these demonstrations are not about the Ukraine war, this war which is on the borders of how many European Union countries? About 7 or 8 or 9. If you include Russia and Belarus, you've got, the whole of Europe's eastern front is affected by a massive war on European soil. So I don't know. I mean, I think, clearly he's got enormous problems, but he is not unique in French history in those kind of confronting those kind of problems.
So, I mean, Macron spoke several times today about reindustrializing the country. And I think one of the contradictions, at least, for those of us a little bit outside watching what's going on rather than protesting on the streets, is that France appears to be doing pretty well. I mean, I was last night at a gathering of a whole lot of startup executives who were here from the US and all over Europe. And they think that France is the place, you know, they're in and out of here constantly, doing deals and meeting people. And this has become like, you know, the hub of activity for all sorts of things. So Matt, I just want to ask you, back to you. One thing that Macron said today, another one of his quotable quotes, you're getting your kids to pay for the system because you're refusing to do so, which is actually a very American concept, to kick the can down the road. You know, I am sort of wondering how you see this contradiction. It seems like France is doing well, and yet we have a president who's warning of all these like flashing red lights and, you know, alarms going off.
I can't necessarily explain it. I mean, it's sort of like the talk of somebody, you know, who is running to become president, who is trying to criticize the policies of the current government, and not somebody who's already president and trying to pass a reform. I think, you know, France has benefited from a lot of positive economic headwinds. I think American companies like coming to France to invest because they just like coming to, the executives like coming to France. I think Macron's reforms have also, you know, some of the things that Victor talked about in terms of the economic liberalization policies that he did when he was Hollande's minister have helped. I also think that just temperamentally, Macron is somebody who likes to lean into a punch. Like he kind of, he's a glutton for punishment in that sense. And I think he enjoys, you know, I think we've all seen him, and you guys probably too have seen him going out into the street and arguing with people. He really likes to do this. And I think, you know, right now we're just seeing him argue with the entire nation, basically. And he thinks he can win that argument, and ultimately he may be right.
Constant, maybe you would like to field this next question. One thing that's really sort of intriguing me is what the ripple effect is on the world stage for Macron's prestige and influence. For 5 years, he has, you know, been what we said on the cover of Time magazine in 2017, the next leader of Europe. And he really did emerge as being what seemed to be the leader of Europe. And certainly the Americans had, you know, just tremendous affection for him. What does this do to that? And then perhaps we'll throw it open to the rest of the panel too.
I'm afraid it's a little bit early to say. I think there's a big difference between what's happening in France and what Macron is doing outside France when he's meeting with other European leaders on the Ukraine war, when he's, you know, launching those extremely ambitious initiatives on the environment and stuff like this. So judging by the Yellow Vest crisis, I didn't get the sense that the Yellow Vest really weakened his stance on the global stage. I think it certainly weakened him in France, but he was rather seen as yet another president dealing with yet another big protest. That said, I think that, you know, this is Macron's second term, and he's obviously thinking about his legacy. There's no threat for him. I mean, he's not going to be reelected, that's for sure. So he might also be thinking about, well, how do I want to be remembered as a French president, not only in France, but also outside? And if he's remembered as the president who finally managed to reform the pension system, despite all the opposition in the street, my guess is he would be pretty happy with this.
Terry, you wanted to add something?
Well, I'd say two things. I think the worldview is a mixed bag, and his achievements on the world scene are mixed bag. In Europe, I think he's successfully pushed a number of issues, and particularly moved Germany on economic and budgetary issue quite successfully. But I think also on several occasions, he punched above his weight and he was punished for it. I think that was particularly the case early in his presidency with President Trump, when he expected to be able to make a move on, the Paris climate deal or the Iran nuclear deal, and miserably failed on both counts. It was not very successful, obviously, at convincing Vladimir Putin not to go to war in Ukraine. You remember that scene where they were both sitting at the opposing end of that very long table. And I think that was probably a misguided effort. So I think, again, it's a mixed bag. On some issues, he has been successful. But I think in the long tradition of French diplomacy, on many occasions, he punched above his weight and was not very successful. The other thing I wanted to say is there's a very tricky visit coming up in the next few days, which is the visit of Charles III, the King in France, who will arrive here in Paris on Sunday night and will stay for a few days. And having a dinner at the Chateau de Versailles with the King in this particular social climate is actually quite tricky. And I think, it's going, there's
the same place where he hosted Vladimir Putin.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot going on this. There's a lot running on this visit. There's a lot of concern about, obvious security issues, especially because the King will be traveling to the Bordeaux area as well. So I think the impact of Macron's global image from this particular crisis could be impacted by the way this visit is conducted and what's going on in the next few days.
Well, I have to just add one thing, which is I do recall Macron, in some ways benefited in the US as being seen as the anti-Trump. And through the Trump years, I had so many people say to me, I can't believe people are protesting about Macron. You're welcome to swap presidents with us.
Yes, but there was also, he obviously played Trump completely wrong. He never got anything from him, even though, he tried to charm him. Remember that ridiculous scene in the White House when they hugged and kissed, which was really embarrassing, I thought. Again, he overestimated his ability to make him move.
Yeah, he tried to be he tried to be the Trump whisperer. He very nearly got Trump to meet the Iranians, but he just failed. But he tried to be the everybody whisperer. He tried to do it with Putin, as we know, and failed. But you kind of have to give him marks for trying, because on almost all those efforts, everybody else could see that it wasn't going to lead anywhere. And Macron's not stupid, I think we all agree. However arrogant he may seem, he's not an idiot, and he must have known that these were almost impossible tasks. So I'm not sure I agree with Constant. I don't think any French president really cares about being remembered for a pension reform. My guess is that he would like to be remembered as the man who brought peace to Europe, or who made the European Union the most formidable superpower the world has ever seen, or something like that, that is very kind of international and sort of a sign of France's power in the world and Europe's power in the world. My feeling is that that's more his thing than domestic politics, which, as we can see now, he's not really very good at. It seems to me that he's more astute when it comes to geopolitics than he is when it comes to French domestic politics.
It certainly seems to me that his, next gig, say, and he, let's face it, he'll only be like 47 when he leaves the Elysee. Not exactly an aging politician, certainly not by current US standards. It seems like his next gig might well be a kind of global figure. I think I would agree with you in some ways, whatever that might be. But talking about legacy, several people that I've interviewed over the last few weeks have raised the specter that everything that's going on in France right now appears to be paving the way for Le Pen. Of course, this is in some ways Macron's worst nightmare, that he would be succeeded by Marine Le Pen. But even union members I spoke to on Monday was saying if the elections were held today, Marine Le Pen would be president. So, Matt, just to get back to this question, or to look forward, of course, 4 years is a very long time, but is it possible that this has given, tremendous momentum to the far right, and what needs to happen to avoid a Le Pen presidency?
Possibly. It kind of looks like it, in the sense that you think about the potential successors to Macron, Bruno Le Maire, Edouard Philippe. Those are people that I think are going to be really damaged by this pension overhaul. I think they're going to have the future of Macron's political party and his political movement, such as it was, which he, created out of whole cloth by sucking in people from the center left and the center right. Those politicians are, I think they're kind of dead in the water for a while, at least for the next election. And so you think, Le Pen, her support, and she's kind of been every single presidential election, she's gotten more support, or the last two. Then you think a little bit more and you kind of try to game it all out. And it's like, does this pension overall, she's already gotten a lot of support from like unions, the far left and the far right. It's kind of been surprising how much support she's gotten from the far left in the second round of the presidential elections. Those are people who definitely didn't vote for Macron, and a lot of them either sat out or they did vote for Le Pen. And I think the question is now, for people on the center left, people who vote for the socialists, that kind of ideological spectrum, are they so, repulsed by this pension overhaul that in fact they don't sit out, they don't vote for the center candidate, whoever that might be? Do they go to Le Pen? I think if a Macronist candidate gets through to the second round somehow, Bruno Le Maire, Edouard Philippe, somebody like that, they could really, Le Pen could really beat them, I think. If somebody from one of the establishment parties, Les Républicains or the Socialists, gets through, I think those people probably could still, they could probably still beat Le Pen. That's
this process, though, has been going on for decades. Macron took advantage of the fact that the kind of center left and the center right were both in kind of decay, and obviously he said, I'm neither right nor left, and he took from both sides. But I don't see, in a way, I sort of think whatever is happening would have happened anyway. You look at the Républicains, which are now completely in disarray because they all wanted a pension reform, but half of them, or a third of them, didn't vote for it. The fact that the party keeps changing its name means it has no identity, has never had a clear identity for the last 30 years. So you have this sort of, how much did the socialists get in the election? He got like in the presidential election.
The first round, it was like
tiny.
Yeah, it was like
it was
6 or 7%.
Something like, it was a tiny amount.
Less than that?
Yeah. It was something like 4%. He didn't get his deposit back, or he didn't get the 5% that he needed, right? So this has been going on for a long time, and I think you're absolutely right to focus on this question, but I don't think it's sort of Macron's fault or anything like that. It's just that he's part of this process of, we have a very divided society in France. And I don't think we should forget that Marine Le Pen won 41.5% in the second round against Macron. And that is astounding. And what is to stop her getting 55 the next time around against any candidate, whether it's a Macronist candidate or a socialist candidate or a center-right candidate or anybody else?
Terry, what do you think? Are we past the stage where, you have the kind of wall, I forget the French term, the wall where everybody unites to block the, right, exactly, the Front Républicain. So has that now broken down, and is the Le Pen presidency far more likely?
It is more likely. Let's take a quick step back to 2017. In 2017, Macron is both the beneficiary and the instrument of the explosion of the political landscape. People have tried the moderate right and the moderate left, under the current constitution ever since 1958. And they have decided that that didn't work. They wanted to try something else. And what they come up with is two candidates that said they're going to change things radically. Macron on the one hand and Marine Le Pen on the other. And obviously, Macron has overpromised and underachieved, which explains a lot of the difficult situation he finds himself in today. One of the, I think, most interesting things he said today in the interview politically is that he has said rightly that there is no alternative majority. And what that pension reform shows and the process through parliament shows is that there was no parliamentary majority for the reform, and there was no parliamentary majority against the reform in the sense that they could have made the government fall, and that didn't happen. So at the moment, we are in a democratic dead end because obviously Macron doesn't speak for the majority anymore, but there's no clear political offer on the table that speaks for a potential majority. And I think Marine Le Pen is closest to that, but she's not there yet, in my opinion.
Go ahead, Matt.
No, I just wanted to point out also that, I mean, Macron did get lucky winning the presidency because Fillon was the front runner, and then he had this huge scandal. I mean, without that scandal, Fillon and the traditional center-right would probably have been
Little scandal with Dominic Strauss-Kahn, as I recall, too.
Yeah,
That was the previous one.
that was
Right, exactly.
a long one anyway.
Getting my
Sarkozy was
skills
unpopular
mixed up.
enough that he whoever ran against him would have. But I'm just saying that we might be overestimating just the kind of huge shift that's happened over the last 6 years.
I don't think so.
No.
I don't think so, because if you look at all the election that followed the election of Macron for president, what used to be the ruling parties up until that point, the socialists on the one hand and the equivalent to the Republican on the other hand, they did extraordinarily poorly on every election since then, except perhaps for some local elections, because when you vote for your mayor, for example, you're more attached to what that particular person has been achieving rather than his political party affiliation. But there's no going back to where we were before 2017.
What do you think, Constant? What is it feasible, envisionable to you that the next president is Marine Le Pen?
Totally. I mean, I think we also need to remember that Marine Le Pen, I mean, the last election showed that President Macron clearly wanted to face Marine Le Pen in the second round. So in a sense, when he does that, he also legitimates her by completely hollowing out the rest of the field, the Socialist Party, Les Républicains. They clearly, as soon as 2020, I think, wanted that that sort of second round to be a new second round of compared to 2017. So he's a very good political strategist, I think, Macron. He won again in 2022, but knowing that after him, we don't know who could succeed him. And he also made sure that Edouard Philippe, when his popularity was rising, would no longer be prime minister. Bruno Le Maire, Gérald Darmanin, who's also on the right, are basically competing for being a potential candidate. So there's this sense that he's not creating the conditions for somebody to succeed him. And you have Marine Le Pen and all of the other panelists have explained very well why she's just rising, because this is the way French politics are. So, yeah.
I think he was a good political strategist when it came to, running for president, but he was not at all a good political strategist when he came to, building a solid majority and, building a political party to speak of that would have put him potentially in a stronger position than he is today.
I meant for the presidential elections, just 2022.
His manifesto speech, I don't know if you remember that, but 4 hours of saying absolutely nothing about what he was going to do, which is, that's in a way the original sin that has come back to haunt him now, that if he'd had a very clear line on exactly what he planned to do as president, if he'd then been voted in on that program, but his program was very incoherent and very sort of long on waffle and very short on details, unlike, funnily enough, some of the other programs like the La France Insoumise and Marine Le Pen's party had much better manifestos. But I think we shouldn't forget that France is kind of one of many industrialized, rich countries around the world that are going through this kind of extraordinary and very damaging division between a sort of populist nationalist side, which in the US is kind of Trump and his supporters and that wing of the Republican Party, which is now apparently the majority of the Republican Party. In the UK, it's the kind of Brexit crowd. And in France, you're seeing this kind of weird alliance between the far left and the far right. Again, that they have a lot in common. Their attitude to Russia, the Ukraine war is quite similar. There's a lot of anti-vaxxers on both sides. I think people have, may have forgotten this, but before COVID, 50%, France was the most anti-vax country in the world. And, this is just extraordinary to recall. Of course, now it's much less so, thank goodness, which shows at least that people can face the facts and change their views accordingly. But every Saturday until the recent demonstrations, there were marches down the street where I lived, where I live, with people complaining about vaccinations. And these are people who are essentially alive because they have all been forced to have 10 vaccines each before they can go to school. I mean, and yet these people are anti-vaxxers. Now, there were a very large number of French people who are anti-vaxxers, and it's just a sign of that kind of weird social media-driven division of societies that we're getting everywhere. I mean, Italy is now run by a far-right leader, which we shouldn't forget. You've got sort of nationalist, populist parties growing up in strange places like Holland, like the Netherlands, and elsewhere. So, we just need to be very, I mean, I don't know, if you are on the other side, so to speak, the kind of metropolitan elite, whatever, science-based group of people who don't agree with that, you've got to be very aware that you are facing an extremely difficult political challenge in France, as in the UK or as in the US.
Well, we want to open up for questions, of which I think there are probably a few in the room and online. There is a wandering mic in the room with Emily.
Can we have a big round of applause for this, please? Thank you all so much for such a wonderful discussion. This is such a pleasure to listen to. And I'm sure there are many, many voices that are just dying to be shared. So raise your hand. We'll start with people in the room and then move into our Zoom questions, but we'll start with the room.
I was very interested in what you said about Le Pen. What about Mélenchon? How you see the impact of what's going on at the moment?
Thierry.
Well, I think Mélenchon is very good at what he does to a certain extent. I don't see him as potential president next time around. I think he is too radical in his attitude and in his policies. He makes mistakes. He has a very he has a very devoted group around him. He has a strong base, but while being perhaps more solid than that of any other party's base, I think is too narrow for him to be expecting to win next time around.
Any show of hands, questions?
Would you like to comment on Edouard Philippe? Because, you know, the word was that Macron felt him to be something of a challenge and wanted him to step back, which he did, and he has his Horizon party and so on. But do you feel he's waiting in the wings to perhaps try to come forward and bring together center right, center left, and so on?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I think Matt, you had something you wanted to say?
Just briefly, I think, yeah, he's kind of the most popular, or at least was the most popular politician in France. I think he was the only person that had more than 50% likability, like of any politician in France. But he's stood behind the pension overall. He hasn't criticized Macron. He's been at his side, and you have to wonder whether he's going to be damaged by that. So it's unclear.
He's definitely running for president next time around. I mean, that's what he's gearing up to do. He makes no secret about it. Don't forget that obviously Macron won't run next time around because he can't. He's had 2 terms and that's it. They've had a very difficult relationship ever since Edouard Philippe left Matignon, because precisely he wants to show that he has more to offer and that he would be more successful as a potential president than Macron is. And also he has a parliamentary group, which sometimes makes life difficult for Macron and his party. So he is getting ready to do so. Will he be able to do so? It remains to be seen. And he has also, of course, these potentially health issues as well. You know, he has immune diseases. He's lost his hair, and so it, you know, obviously, we hope that it won't interfere with the potential campaign, but it might.
Other questions in the room? Don't be shy. Yes.
Word about the military alliance between Australia, UK, and US, and how did France get it so wrong? How were they cut out, and why?
Ooh. Well, the French knew that something was up before. That's one of the reasons they were so annoyed with the Australians and the British in particular, because they knew that the Australians were doing something behind the scenes, and they actually asked Scott Morrison, I think it was, wasn't it, at the time, saying, "What is going on? Do you want nuclear-powered submarines?" You know, the French, of course, make their own nuclear-powered submarines. This is not about nuclear-armed submarines, just to be clear. This is about nuclear-powered submarines. So the French actually said to the Australians, you know, we can, you know, if there's something wrong, we can give you another offer. But essentially, the Australians lied to them, and they were very upset about that. The thing that I find absolutely baffling on the part of the Australians, the British, and the Americans is that they hid this from the French. Given that the French were going to find out on the day it was announced, it seemed incredibly stupid and undiplomatic not to give the French some advance warning, but there was no such advance warning. And the Americans kind of recanted and admitted they had been foolish, and they apologized. The British and the Australians, I don't think ever did, but certainly the Australians, the subsequent government took a very different view. Yeah, I mean, I don't think the French were at fault in the sense of, you know, I mean, they just didn't see it coming, basically. But it's always the problem of being a sort of second-rate power, if I can use that expression, when you're selling weapons. I mean, I remember when the French were trying to sell the Rafale to South Korea. I think the South Korean Air Force, you know, tried all the planes out and decided that the Rafale was the best, and they bought F-16s because, you know, in a war, who do you want on your side? Do you want the United States or do you want France? And, you know, who are you going to get your supplies from? And unfortunately, that is the kind of problem that AUKUS posed for the French again. And of course, understandably, the French were very upset about it. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
And I think, Victor, you were there as well. The briefing that the Quai d'Orsay had for British and American journalists. I had never been in such an extraordinary gathering in which they just basically sat there and spewed fury for 2 hours.
And the other thing that this did, which was actually wonderful from a journalistic point of view for us, was that normally all foreign policy of any importance is run out of the Élysée Palace. I mean, this isn't just Macron, this is just the way it is in France. And the sort of Quai d'Orsay, which has all the experts and the people who speak the languages and know what they're doing, is always kind of, you know, shoved aside or put in the background. And on this occasion, we had this wonderful thing where suddenly Macron was so angry that he just sort of let the K brief us and tell us what was really going on, which was the first time. And I suppose also it meant that he wasn't directly involved in talking to us about what was a massive screw up. But it was great because we had, as Viv said, we had all these wonderful briefings that we'd never had before. You know, the ambassadors came from around the world to tell us what was happening, but it was lovely.
Also, it was Le Drian's, the foreign minister at the time. It was like his baby because he negotiated it when he was the defense minister. Then he went to, so this was like, you know, arguably his crowning achievement as, you know, as a French public servant. And then the whole thing was torpedoed, so to speak, by
But I think just to
by the Americans.
just to get back to Macron and you know, I think this kind of like hit such a raw nerve because it belittled him as a world leader, and he regards himself as a world leader of great stature. Good question, and it's sort of forgotten in some ways at the moment.
And we have a follow-up question right here. Yeah.
It's on a different topic. I want to go back to the situation today and ask for your short-term prediction, short to medium-term prediction about what is going to happen in France. Will the demonstrations and the disruptions explode and reach a tipping point where there's general disorder, or will, as I'm sure Macron hopes, will sort of gradually die down, maybe take a long time, but sort of like people will realize, okay, there's nothing they can do. So what's your short-term, medium-term prediction for life in France?
Constant, you want to try that one?
It's hard to say because if you look at the protesters right now, you have the sort of very typical French protests organized by unions, very well organized, very peaceful. And for the past week, a new type of protest of small groups, mostly young people, sometimes rampaging through the streets in Paris, who are not necessarily those sort of very radicalized so-called black bloc people. I mean, I met a lot of young people that for them, that was the first time that they were protesting. They had taken part in all of those very peaceful protests with the unions. And now they were basically thinking, well, that didn't work. So what are we going to do next? You know, we're going to raise the stake. And last time that protest really managed to force the government to back down was the Yellow Vest. And that was a fairly violent protest. So we're going to do the same. So there's this on the one hand. The government, they passed the law. The opposition, they filed a request to basically challenge the law in the Constitutional Council. So that's a legal challenge. It's going to take weeks, probably. I'm not sure it's going to change something, to be honest, because this is a little bit complicated. The opposition also may want to hold a referendum to challenge the law. This is also extremely complicated. They need to gather more than 5 million votes from the French people. It may take a lot of time. My sense right now from the protesters is that they want to reproduce what happened in 2006 with the CPE, le contrat première embauche, which was basically a youth jobs contract that was passed under Chirac. The law was passed, but the opposition in the street was such that after a few weeks, they actually repealed the law. And I think this is a precedent that is very strong in the minds of the protesters today. But what form it will take is, it's very hard to say right now.
Other questions? Yes.
If you had to actually to rebound on the same question, if you had the crystal ball, do you think there is a chance that in the near future there's going to be a change of republic, moving to a sixth republic with what's happening?
Jerry.
I think it's really hard to say. I think the issue today, as I said, is that the current situation is a political dead end. There's no majority. And again, what the pension reform has shown is there was no majority to support the reform, and there was no majority to throw out the government. And if you were to dissolve parliament and have parliamentary elections today, it's very likely that there would not be any majority as well able to, to govern. So that's why it's a very tricky question. And to be honest, I really don't know the answer to your question. But I think Macron is paying very dearly the fact that he completely neglected how necessary and how important it was to build a political base, to build a solid political party, to build to have allies. I mean, we could discuss, and it's really interesting, the complete failure today of his relationship with Laurent Berger, the head of the moderate trade union CFDT, which is a huge strategic mistake in my opinion. The way he completely let this guy become, the opponent number one to his reform. And I think he also neglected completely to establish a political presence throughout the country, with local officials, with NGOs and stuff like that. But there's no presence. There's no actual presence of Macron supporters, and that as a result of that, he has no relay. He has no support. He has no support system, whether in parliament or throughout the country, to help him go through that crisis. And I think that's a huge weakness in his political situation today.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of the, somebody was asking about Edouard Philippe, and of course his strength is that, he's the mayor of Le Havre, and you have, that's the way traditionally you make it big in French politics, and Macron just came out of nowhere. He'd never held any elected position at all before, which is quite unusual. So that's his big weakness. But I haven't been reporting from the front lines in the last few weeks, so I don't know the answer to this, but the important thing is sort of how angry are people really, I think. And maybe, Constant, you know this better than me, but one of my colleagues from the BBC was asked about what would happen if they use 49.3, which is this kind of government decree, as it were, to push things through when Parliament doesn't approve. And he said, well, the people will be very angry, or they will say they're very angry. And I thought that was quite an interesting comment, because are people really, really upset about this? Are they sort of so angry that they are prepared to, to engage in these kind of demonstrations?
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer as well. Actually, I plan to know the answer in the next few days. That's my hope. But I mean, I very much agree with what Thierry just said. I think there's also this today in his interview today, Macron, or actually that was yesterday when he spoke to lawmakers, he said, the mob, the crowd doesn't have the same legitimacy as lawmakers who are elected in parliament. And I mean, I thought that was interesting, because you have in France this sort of different political legitimacies. You have the president who's elected by universal suffrage. You have the parliament, the lawmakers who are also elected. And then you have the street. And this is very much, there's a deep-seated belief in France that if you want to get changes, you also take to the street to do this. And today we have a parliament that, first of all, doesn't like, I think, to be obliged to pass a law with the 49.3, this constitutional tool. I think most of the lawmakers from Macron's party wanted a vote, so they're not extremely happy about the way it was passed. You have a presidency that, as Thierry pointed out, neglected the parliament and the constitution of a strong coalition. And then you have the street, which is very angry at the fact that after 2 months of rather peaceful protests, the president didn't even want to meet with Laurent Berger from the CFDT, who was again considered a moderate. He supported Macron's previous reform in 2019, pension reform. So you have this sort of situation where different political legitimacies do not meet one another, and we end up with this sort of perhaps institutional crisis, I think. Just one last thing. Yesterday morning, I mean, after the count of where he's really thinking that it would be extremely difficult for Macron to govern after what happened. But yesterday night, they actually passed a law on nuclear production with a vast majority in parliament, which shows that, they still can find a majority in parliament depending on which bill they push through. But this is just to say that it doesn't mean that the country is completely ungovernable right now.
Could I add something just real quick? Yeah, I'm just about the Sixth Republic question. I wonder if France has this, I think it's pretty much a unique political system with this president that is nearly monarchical as long as he's elected. And
he is meeting King Charles at the
well,
Chateau.
there you go. And there's and I think that this is a political system which I don't know exists anywhere else in the world, where basically you can totally ignore the parliament and pass whatever law you want, as long as you've been elected. They put some limitations on it. They did, right, exactly. But there are some. There used to not be any limitations on it. I think you could use it. You used to be able to use it as much as you want. And so I do, this has been one of the criticisms of the Yellow Vests during their protests, which is just the lack of democracy in the French political system. And I think, the existence of Count Neuftois is a prime example of that. And does this lend any kind of momentum to efforts to change that? And yeah, time will tell.
What is quite striking is that Macron understands the anger. He knows the anger. And, he's been very accurate at assessing the state of the country very early on. I just have two real quick quotes from speeches he made in 2018. So that's almost 5 years ago. In February, he said, "I don't forget where I come from." He was just elected a few months before that. "I am not the natural child of quiet times in political life. I am the product of a kind of brutality of history, a break-in because France was unhappy and worried. If I forget all of this, that will be the beginning of trying times." And another one, which I think is quite revealing as well. "I have not forgotten the fear of social economic downgrading for oneself and one's children, the rage when faced with the government powerlessness, a country that feels it is cut in half, not just between political parties, but even worse, still between those at the bottom and those at the so-called top. At the bottom, women and men working and those looking for work and not finding any, all those who struggle to make ends meet. And at the top, those who are in government, speeches made by the so-called powerful who never change anything and that nobody even understands anymore. The impression citizens have that they are ignored, despised, that they can see where we should and can go together." And it's, one of the interesting things and the paradoxes about Macron's presidency is that how can you be so good and accurate at describing the sense of, the country, the problems the countries are facing, and find yourself really unable to answer.
Emily, do we have questions online or?
We have a couple questions online. I think we have time for one more question with someone in the back who was very enthusiastic to navigate my little maze. Excuse me.
I have one question for Matt or Victor, maybe, because I think the Wall Street Journal and the FT especially have covered this in a kind of a different way, I would say. And the question would be, why do you think that even in this case, so much conversation and so much analysis is focused on Macron's personality, and while at the same time, I think like more materialist macroeconomic approach seems, I don't know, more fruitful, more explanatory, or something like this,
That's I think I understand your question. I mean, to me, in a way, the interesting question is why Macron doesn't get much more wholehearted support from the people who would naturally support him in the center right. I had lunch with a business person the other day who's in finance and so on, and I was really surprised. I was expecting him to say, I hate the demonstrators, Macron's trying to do the right thing, but instead he was very critical of Macron. And I think that is, perhaps just the pain of being a French leader is you get criticized by everybody. But it is kind of odd in a way that the Republican people in parliament would simply just for fear of the street would vote against something that they believe in, which was the pension reform. I mean, it was in the manifesto for the Republican Party. The leader of the party said they should said they should vote for it, and they, many of them didn't want to. And to me, in a way, that's the most surprising thing, is that Macron's naturals, we can understand how the far left and the far right don't like him and would oppose him, but you would think that the center right in particular, for economic reasons and for reasons of economic management, would actually support him, and they don't seem to be doing so in a very wholehearted way, which I find surprising. I hope that answers some of your question.
Yeah, I'm kind of sympathetic with your question, which is I'm more inclined to like a macroeconomic materialist analysis of what's going on. And when I was covering the Yellow Vest protests, and I went to kind of the small cities in the provinces that where the Yellow Vests were strongest, and I'm thinking to myself, it's pretty good in France. Like the French healthcare system is amazing, universal. Everybody has access to it. The French schools are really good. Compare them to America, where just the public school system is so variable and in many places so awful. What are these people so upset about? And I think that for partly to answer that question, I think you do have to look at Macron the person. His personality and is really important here. I think in his background also, because he comes from Rothschild, he's a banker. That's a profile that just the French people are really suspicious of. And I think just, what I was talking about earlier, which is the way he talks to the public, the way he communicates with people. Arguably, there's something grating about that. This just kind of very argumentative, lack of sympathy. There's something about, he's arguably not a great communicator for the people who are working class people, the people who don't share his background. I think for a lot of the people, well, particularly who read the New York Times, our readers are totally different. But people who read the Financial Times, they're very sympathetic to Macron. But people not from his background are not. And so I think you have to look at Macron the person to really understand what's going on.
If he was a smart politician, he would get every French person to look at their pay slips. I don't know if you've seen a French pay slip. I didn't get one because I was sort of, paid by a British company and so on. But my daughter's just started working in France, and the number of deductions is absolutely colossal. And they're all social security, different forms of social security. And I think there's much more social security deductions for an individual, certainly at her level of pay, than there is for income tax. So the real big deductions are coming from your social security contributions. But nobody seems to sort of mind about that. Maybe, as you say, they're getting a great service, certainly compared to the UK, where I've just come back from. It's very depressing to see the state of public services. But I mean, if he was a better domestic politician, he would say to people, look, all these deductions, we can make them lower. You can get more pay in your pocket if we reform this system. But he hasn't done that at all. I don't.
And wages are pretty low in France when you compare to the United States or even the UK. And so
I think he touched on that today. And I think that's clear to any of us living in this country, is how remarkably low French take-home pay is, right up to professional level.
He mentioned that the minimum pay in France was higher than almost anywhere else in Europe, but the median pay is only just above the SMIC, just above the minimum wage, which is quite extraordinary compared to other countries in the neighborhood.
Yeah, but amazingly, that does extend all the way up the pay scale to, doctors earn so much less in France than they do in the US, and same thing with lawyers. And so there is a kind of equality there, at least. But I think, fundamentally, when you're thinking about how much money you're taking home with you, that can obviously, for people particularly at the lower end of the income scale, can be quite frustrating.